you can kind of even see how that actually works using some of these tools. So again here we've got some advanced options over here on the boot tab. One thing I want to point out about MSConfig is that this is a good way to start your, to configure your boot menu. A GUI way to do that without having to go in through the command line and learn a lot of BCD edit commands or things like that. So you can see I actually have a dual boot set up here, Windows 7, Windows 8. If you want to force it to go to safe mode boot all the time, you can go in there. There's a few other options here for troubleshooting purposes. Base video, if you're having problems with your video driver, that will force it to use the standard VGA driver. This, I believe, will print out all the drivers as they load on the screen, turn on boot logging. And there's also, again, advanced options, just like in the old Windows 98 days. And this is actually a good way to set this if you want to do some really advanced JEDI stuff and go in and do some kernel debugging. You can configure that through here. Come in here, turn on debug, choose what port I want to use for debugging. Say if I wanted to use 1394, what channel. And I think we may talk about that in a future episode. That's kind of, again, sort of advanced JEDI tricks, but we use that a lot of time here at Microsoft for, you know, really getting into the weeds of what's going on the system. So you can also in here choose number of processors. If you're having a problem and you suspect maybe you have a bad CPU, you can block that down to one CPU. If you have a multi-core system, things like that, you can limit your amount of memory that Windows will use if you maybe think you have some bad RAM. Occasionally we will use those for troubleshooting if we suspect hardware problems on the system. So this is MSConfig. You know, not a whole lot different than what we had back in the Windows 98 days, but it's still pretty useful for doing sort of those startup things. Now, the other tool I want to talk about is AutoRuns, which is kind of the power user version of this that really gets in. MSConfig won't necessarily show you everything. There's some things that it doesn't quite know about, and sometimes a lot of spyware, things like that, will get into sort of sneaky places in your system. And AutoRuns will show you a lot of those that MSConfig won't even show you. So let's go ahead and fire up AutoRuns here. And this is, again, you can get this from sysinternals. Sysinternals.com, which is hosted on Microsoft.com. And as you can see here, when I boot this up, I get a much larger view of everything that's starting up. And a lot of these you see are kind of the same things I saw in MSConfig. I see some of these Intel things. It'll tell you where they're coming from in the registry. For example, these are located in the current version run key. You know, it's pretty comprehensive. All kinds of drivers. You'll see some of these will show up highlighted in red, and the ones that highlight in red, what that means is that there's not a description or a publisher name that it can determine. So, for example, this one here, it's just a VBS script. Visual Basic Script file. There's not really a way to specify those things. So not really a problem. I think you'll see this on just about every system. This gather network info is a standard Windows 7 thing, but that's why it shows up in red.
So I think the first thing people would notice is there's a lot of tabs in here.
There are a lot of tabs.
Where do you focus the bulk of your time when you're in here?
The tabs are a way to filter this view down. So what you're actually seeing here is you know, it defaults to this Everything tab. And I would start with Log On. These are the things they're going to kind of start up at the time of log on.
Yeah.
And these are a lot of the same kind of things that you'll see in MSConfig as well. You'll also see Explorer here. These are things that have plugged in, hooked into Explorer. So for example here, I've got an Adobe Reader shell extension which sort of helps launching PDF files. I've also got some Intel things here, for example, under context menu handlers. And what that is for example, I right-click on the desktop, and in addition to the normal stuff, I have some graphics properties here, which fires up an Intel control panel.
Yeah.
This is where that comes from. So if I want to disable that, I can do that here. I can uncheck that box. And that's a good point here. In order to make changes here, I actually have to run as administrator.
Yeah.
And helpfully, AutoRuns will prompt me to do that. So I'll go ahead and click that, and what will happen is it'll actually close and reload. Now I'm running with admin privileges, and I can go in and uncheck that box.
So what's a method that the typical person would use to know whether or not they can shut something off in here? I know back in the day, must have been Windows 95, 98 days, there was a site, Black Viper, that a lot of people would use to see, you know, if I want to set my machine up for gaming,
right,
turn these things off, leave these things on.
Right.
How do you know whether you can turn something off and it's not going to hurt your system, or at least degrade things that you want to work?
So there's a couple ways you can do that. And the first way is under the options view here. There are filter options, and the default here is to hide Windows entries. So by default, AutoRuns is not showing us things that belong to Windows itself necessarily. Yeah. You can also come in here and hide Microsoft entries altogether, and this is potentially a good way to go because, let's be honest, you know, there are some Microsoft things that can occasionally cause you problems, but a large percentage of the time when you're running into trouble, it's some third-party thing, maybe isn't encoded very well, that sort of thing. So that's a good way to kind of filter things down.
And a long time ago, there used to be a lot more things running that you probably might not have needed on your gaming machine. Whereas now, Windows 7, Windows 8, very minimalistic. They're not going to be running a bunch of things that you don't need. Yeah,
in fact, even one of the things between Windows Vista and Windows 7, one of the big pushes in Windows 7 was to cut down the footprint of Windows and kind of shut down a lot of those background services, or at least, you know, not having them running all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll fire up once in a while, once a week to do something, and then they'll shut back down, that kind of thing, where maybe in Windows Vista they were just running all the time.
Yeah, and with Windows 8, they've taken that concept and turned it into an art.
Even further. Yeah, and especially Windows 8, because as people are more and more interested in, you know, mobile computing, using new form factors like tablets and ultrabooks, and battery life becomes more and more of a factor. So the push these days, you know, in contrast to say the Vista era, or even back further, is to really kind of cut down CPU cycles, keep things from running that you don't need to. And so a lot of the Microsoft stuff, especially now, is pretty good about that.
Yeah.
But, you know, we can't guarantee that third-party apps aren't going to go load something up there that's just going to burn up your battery, or, you know, do things you don't want to do, slow things down. So that's where AutoRuns and MSConfig, and especially AutoRuns, are really good tools to kind of see what those things are. So just kind of quickly going through, oh, and one other thing, actually. So another thing you mentioned, how can I know what these things are and whether I can safely turn them off? As in some of the other sysinternals tools, if you right-click here, there's a search online thing here. So for example, this syntp-enh, which is running on my machine every time I boot up. I don't know what that is. Maybe I can search online here, and I get a Bing hit for it. You know, I can find out what these things are. And it turns out, for example here, systp is a process installed alongside the Synaptics touchpad for laptop touchpads. So I can turn that off, but I'm probably not going to get a full functionality out of my touchpad. I'm not going to get all the gestures and the two-finger things. It might just be sort of a basic functionality if you disable that. What actually happens when you disable these is it actually moves them into a special disabled folder. So for example, this IGFX tray, which is another piece of the Intel software for the